Billy Bob didn't raise his voice. That was the unsettling part. He spoke the way someone does when they's already thought through every angle and decided they weren't backing down. He tilted his head slightly, eyes steady on Jimmy, and said that acting wasn't a party trick or a punchline, that for some people it was a place where they put things they didn't know how to carry anywhere else. The words weren't dramatic, but they landed with weight. The band stopped playing altogether, the applause sign flickered and went dark, and the studio audience shifted, sensing the rules of the room changing in real time. Jimmy laughed again, a little louder than before, and clapped his hands as if to reset the energy. He tossed out a self-deprecating line about being the guy who trips over his own punchlines, hoping to dissolve the moment. But Billy Bob didn't let it evaporate. He nodded politely, then continued, explaining how easily sincerity gets flattened into irony on late-night couches, how vulnerability becomes something to poke at because it makes everyone else uncomfortable. His tone wasn't accusatory, yet somehow it felt more confronting than anger. Fallon's grin stayed frozen, his eyes darting briefly toward the producers behind the cameras. The crowd offered a few scattered claps, unsure whether they were allowed to respond. Billy Bob leaned back, finally breaking eye contact, and told a short story about an early audition that went nowhere, about being laughed out of a room for taking a role too seriously. He said it shaped him, not by hardening him, but by teaching him to choose carefully where he gave his honesty. When he looked back at Jimmy, it was clear the story wasn't random. It was a mirror, held up gently but unmistakably. Jimmy tried again, this time steering toward music, mentioning Billy Bob's band and joking about late-night jam sessions gone wrong. The joke hung in the air. Billy Bob smiled, but there was something sad in it. He replied that music, like acting, was another place where people hid parts of themselves, and when those places were treated like toys, something fragile got lost. He said it wasn't about being humorless, it was about knowing when laughter was a bridge and when it was a wall. A murmur rippled through the audience. This wasn't explosive television, it was worse. It was intimate. The kind of tension that made people lean forward without realizing they'd stopped breathing. Jimmy's shoulders tightened. He nodded along, interjecting small affirmations, sure, yeah, of course, but his usual rhythm was gone. The teleprompter scrolled unused. The producers' headsets crackled with quiet urgency. Billy Bob paused, then added that he respected the format, respected Jimmy's talent, but sometimes wondered why sincerity had to fight so hard to survive in rooms designed for millions of viewers. He said it calmly, as if inviting conversation, but the question hovered like a challenge. Jimmy swallowed, laughed softly, and admitted that live television thrived on pace, on jokes landing fast before anyone could think too hard. That's kind of the gig, he said, trying to lighten it. Billy Bob nodded again. That's the problem, he replied. The silence that followed felt endless. The band leader glanced toward Jimmy, waiting for a cue that didn't come. Jimmy shifted in his seat, tapping his cue cards against his knee. He tried to pivot, suggesting a game they'd planned, something silly with impressions and props. Billy Bob looked at the cards, then back at Jimmy, and gently declined. He said he'd rather finish the thought he'd started, since they were already there. That's when the audience gasped, not loudly, but collectively. Jimmy's smile finally slipped, just for a second, revealing something raw. Underneath, frustration, maybe even doubt. He joked that the show might be turning into group therapy, earning a few uneasy laughs. Billy Bob responded that therapy was what happened when people finally stopped joking. The line wasn't sharp, but it cut deep. Jimmy leaned back, exhaled, and ran a hand through his hair. For the first time, he looked less like a host and more like someone caught off script. He admitted that live TV demanded control, that moments like this made him nervous. Billy Bob listened, genuinely, then said that nervousness was often the doorway to honesty. He wasn't trying to hijack the show, he explained, he was trying to protect something that mattered to him. The cameras kept rolling. Somewhere in the control room, a producer debated cutting to commercial, but the moment felt too charged, too human. Jimmy glanced toward the camera, then back to Billy Bob, and forced a laugh that didn't quite land. Well, he said, half joking, half serious, you're really putting me on the spot here. Billy Bob met his gaze. Live TV does that, he said softly. The audience sat frozen between applause and silence, aware they were witnessing something unscripted and irreversible. Jimmy nodded slowly, as if coming to a decision only he could see. He straightened his jacket, placed the cue cards on the desk, and looked out toward the studio lights with an expression no one had seen from him before, resigned, reflective, unguarded. Whatever came next, it was clear the show had already crossed a line it couldn't step back over. Jimmy tried to reclaim the rhythm by joking about how his mom always told him not to argue with people smarter than him on live television. A few laughs fluttered out, thin and uncertain. Billy Bob smiled at that, genuinely this time, and said intelligence had nothing to do with it, listening did. He spoke about how shows like this shaped public conversations, how millions of people absorbed the tone whether they realized it or not. He wasn't accusing Jimmy of anything malicious, he said, he was asking whether speed had replaced depth because depth took too long to explain. The words settled heavily. Jimmy nodded, eyes focused now, not darting. He admitted that the show ran on instinct, that sometimes instinct meant deflection. He joked again, but quieter, that maybe he hid behind humor because it was safer than silence. The audience reacted to that, real applause this time, not prompted. Billy Bob acknowledged it with a small bow of the head, as if thanking the room rather than taking credit. He continued, describing moments on sets where actors sat in silence before a scene, not because they were brooding, but because silence helped them arrive. He contrasted that with the fear of dead air, how television treated quiet like an enemy. Sometimes, he said, quiet is where the truth is waiting. The band leader rested his hands on the keyboard, unmoving, as though afraid a note might break something fragile. Jimmy leaned forward, elbows on the desk, and admitted that silence terrified him. He said the idea of millions watching, waiting, judging, it pushed him to fill every gap. His voice wavered slightly, surprising even himself. Billy Bob didn't interrupt. He let the pause stretch, proving his point. The audience leaned in, the kind of collective stillness that made the air feel thicker. When Jimmy finally spoke again, he said he'd never thought of it that way. He laughed softly, more at himself than at the situation. He asked Billy Bob whether he ever regretted being so serious in a world that rewarded lightness. Billy Bob answered without hesitation, no. He said seriousness didn't mean joyless, that humor meant more when it wasn't used as armor. He talked about laughing hardest with people who also knew how to sit with pain. Jimmy absorbed that, nodding slowly. He joked that this wasn't how the segment was supposed to go, then admitted he didn't hate it. The honesty drew another wave of applause. But beneath it, tension still hummed. The producers were whispering urgently now, the stage manager hovering just out of frame. Time was slipping. Billy Bob glanced at the clock on the wall and acknowledged it. He said he knew they were running long, that this wasn't convenient. He looked back at Jimmy and said some conversations weren't. He thanked Jimmy for not cutting him off. That gratitude, offered so plainly, caught Jimmy off guard. He smiled, genuinely, and said he didn't want to be the guy who shut down something real just to stay on schedule. Then, almost without realizing it, Jimmy admitted something deeper, that he sometimes felt trapped by the character people expected him to play every night. The happy host, the easy laugh, the buffer between discomfort and the audience. He said it quietly, almost as if confessing to himself. The room went still again. Billy Bob nodded with understanding, saying roles had a way of clinging long after the cameras stopped. For a moment, they weren't host and guest. They were two men talking about masks. The audience sensed it, too, the shift from spectacle to intimacy. Jimmy joked weakly that this was the most therapy he'd ever had without a couch. Billy Bob smiled and said couches had their uses. The control room finally made the call. A producer's voice crackled faintly through Jimmy's earpiece, urging a break. Jimmy closed his eyes briefly, then opened them and looked straight into the camera. He said they were supposed to go to commercial, but he wanted to finish the thought. The band stayed silent. The cameras stayed locked. Jimmy thanked Billy Bob for challenging him, for not letting the joke slide. He admitted that part of him wanted to brush it off, to keep things easy. Easy is my job, he said, then corrected himself. Or at least, it's what I thought my job was. The audience applauded again, louder now, supportive. Billy Bob replied that easy wasn't the enemy, avoidance was. He said Jimmy didn't have to change who he was, just recognize the power of the platform he stood on. He said moments like this, uncomfortable as they were, stayed with people longer than punchlines. His voice softened as he spoke, not preaching, just sharing. Jimmy nodded, eyes glossy but steady. He joked that his publicist was probably having a heart attack. Laughter rippled through the crowd, easing the tension just enough. Then Jimmy surprised everyone, including himself. He set his cards aside again and said, "You know what? Let's stop pretending this is a normal show tonight." A hush fell. He admitted he didn't know how to transition back to comedy after this, that it felt wrong. He looked to Billy Bob, half smiling, half serious, and said, "I think you broke me a little." Billy Bob chuckled softly and said breaking wasn't always bad, sometimes it let light in. Jimmy stood up slowly, adjusting his jacket. The movement startled the audience. He walked around the desk, something he almost never did, and faced Billy Bob directly. He said he needed a minute, not a commercial, not a sketch, but a minute to breathe. He turned to the camera and apologized to the audience, saying this wasn't planned, but it was real. He took a breath, then said something no one expected, that he was stepping away for the rest of the show. Not quitting television, not walking out forever, but acknowledging that he couldn't just snap back into host mode. He said the band would play them out, that the audience deserved honesty more than continuity. Gasps rippled through the studio. Billy Bob stood as well, clearly surprised. Jimmy smiled at him, grateful, a little shaken. "You didn't make me quit," he said softly. "You reminded me why I started." The band finally began to play, tentative at first, then fuller. As the music swelled, Jimmy waved to the crowd, not with his usual exuberance, but with something quieter, more sincere. The cameras pulled back, catching Billy Bob standing there, hands clasped, watching with a thoughtful expression. The audience rose to its feet, applause thundering, not for a punchline, but for a moment that refused to be smoothed over. And as the lights dimmed, it was clear this wasn't just another viral clip. It was a rupture, a pause in the machine, sparked by a live clash that turned into something neither man could have scripted.